The morning sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds in Sergeant James Morrison's office, creating prison bar patterns across his desk. 23 years on the force had earned him this space, small but private, where commendations lined the walls, and a photo of his son, Michael, smiled at him from beside his computer monitor. The image showed Michael in his graduation gown from 4 years ago, before he'd moved away to pursue his career. They barely spoke these days. Morrison's coffee had grown cold, forgotten during his absorption in the case file spread before him. Marcus Thompson, age 34, African-American male, suspected of involvement in a string of armed robberies in the precinct's upscale neighborhoods. The evidence was circumstantial at best: a grainy security camera image of a black male of similar build, a witness description that could fit half the men in the city, and Thompson's previous record from his youth, a possession charge from 15 years ago. But Morrison had learned to trust his gut over the years. Something about Thompson's demeanor during questioning yesterday had raised red flags: the way he'd maintained eye contact too steadily, how his answers seemed too practiced, too perfect. Besides, Morrison had seen enough criminals to know their tells. People like Thompson didn't just leave their past behind. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Officer Chen, a rookie who still carried herself with the eager nervousness of the newly graduated, stood in the doorway. "Sarge, we got another hit on the Thompson case. A witness from the Madison Street robbery thinks they recognized him from the photo lineup." Morrison straightened in his chair, feeling the familiar surge of satisfaction when pieces started falling into place. "Positive ID?" "Well..." Chen shifted her weight, glancing down at her notepad. "They said they were about 70% sure. But with his prior record..." "That's enough for probable cause," Morrison cut in, already reaching for his jacket. "Get the paperwork started. We'll pick him up this afternoon." He paused, studying Chen's hesitant expression. "Something else?" "It's just," the witness also said, they weren't completely sure about the height. And the security footage timestamp shows the robbery happened during Thompson's shift at the community center. Morrison felt a flicker of irritation. These young officers, fresh out of sensitivity training, always second-guessing, always looking for reasons to hold back. "Chen, you know as well as I do that timestamps can be doctored. And community center employees can have accomplices cover their shifts." He stood, sliding his gun into its holster. "Sometimes you have to read between the lines. Experience teaches you to see patterns people try to hide." As Chen left to prepare the arrest warrant, Morrison's eyes fell on Michael's photo again. His son had always been idealistic too, always arguing about justice system reform during their increasingly heated Sunday dinners. Before they'd stopped having them all together. Morrison pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the satisfaction of closing another case. He'd learned long ago that in this job, you had to trust your instincts. And his instincts were telling him Marcus Thompson was guilty. He didn't notice that his coffee cup had left a ring on Thompson's file, a circle around the man's employment history, obscuring the name of his supervisor at the community center. Marcus Thompson stood in the doorway of his classroom at the Riverside Community Center, watching as his last student of the day carefully packed up her laptop. Sarah, a grandmother in her 60s, had been attending his basic computer skills course for the past month, determined to learn how to video chat with her grandchildren in California. "You're making great progress, Sarah," he said, smiling as she successfully saved her practice document without assistance. "Next week we'll get you set up with that Zoom account." "Thanks to you, Marcus," she beamed, patting his arm as she passed. "My daughter won't believe it when I call her on that computer thing. You know, you remind me of my grandson, same patience, same kind heart." After Sarah left, Marcus began his end-of-day routine, straightening chairs and shutting down the donated computers that lined the walls. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, warming the room's institutional beige walls. He'd spent the last 3 years transforming this space from a storage room into a place of learning, a place where people could better themselves. His phone buzzed, a text from his wife, Andrea, "Don't forget to pick up Brian's inhaler from the pharmacy. Love you." Marcus checked his watch. If he hurried, he could make it before closing time. Their insurance had finally approved the prescription after weeks of back and forth, and their 7-year-old son's asthma had been acting up lately. He'd already had to miss 1 day of school this week. As he reached for his jacket, the center's director, Lisa Martinez, appeared in the doorway. Her face carried an expression he'd never seen before, concern mixed with something else. Fear? Marcus, there are police officers here. They want to speak with you. His stomach dropped. He'd seen that same look on his mother's face 20 years ago, when officers had shown up at their door, convinced his younger brother had been involved in a local break-in. The same officers who'd planted evidence when they couldn't find any. His brother had spent 2 years in juvenile detention before the truth finally came out. Did they say what it's about? He asked, keeping his voice steady despite the sudden dryness in his throat. Lisa shook her head. Something about a robbery? Marcus, I told them you were teaching during that time, that I saw you myself, but... It's okay, Lisa, he interrupted gently, though his heart was racing. I haven't done anything wrong. We'll get this sorted out. As he followed her down the hallway, Marcus's mind raced through the potential ramifications. He'd worked so hard to build this life, the teaching job, the mortgage on their small house, Brian's private school tuition that stretched their budget but gave their son opportunities Marcus had never had. One false accusation could unravel it all. He spotted them before they saw him, 3 officers in the reception area. The older one, gray-haired and wearing sergeant stripes, was studying a paper in his hands. Something about his stance, the set of his jaw, told Marcus this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. Marcus took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He thought of Andrea, of Brian waiting for his inhaler. He thought of his students, Sarah, and Jerome who was studying for his GED, and teenagers like Maria who came to his coding workshop dreaming of college scholarships. Keep calm, he whispered to himself. Remember what Dad always said, truth is bulletproof. But as the sergeant looked up and their eyes met, Marcus saw something he recognized from too many encounters over the years, the look of a man who'd already made up his mind, who saw not Marcus Thompson the teacher, the father, the community member, but simply another suspect who fit a profile. The sergeant stepped forward, his hand moving to rest near his holster. Marcus Thompson? I'm Sergeant Morrison. We need you to come with us. The fluorescent lights of the community center buzzed overhead as Morrison moved forward, his practiced eyes scanning Thompson for any sign of resistance. Behind him, Chen and Rodriguez flanked out automatically, maintaining tactical positioning even in the seemingly peaceful environment. The watching staff members pressed themselves against the walls, their faces a mixture of shock and indignation. There must be some mistake. Lisa Martinez stepped forward, her voice trembling with controlled anger. Marcus was teaching during. Ma'am, please step back, Morrison commanded, never taking his eyes off Thompson. This is police business. Marcus felt the weight of choices pressing down on him. Every muscle in his body screamed to run, to resist, to shout about the injustice unfolding. But experience had taught him the cost of such reactions. Instead, he forced himself to breathe slowly, to keep his hands visible at his sides. Sergeant Morrison, he said, working to keep his voice steady, I have a son waiting for his asthma medication. Could I at least call my wife first? Morrison's jaw tightened. In his experience, suspects often tried to delay arrest with personal stories. Yet something in Thompson's calm demeanor made him hesitate. He glanced at Officer Chen, noting the uncertainty in her expression. Make it quick, Morrison grudgingly conceded, nodding to Chen. Officer Chen will dial for you. As Chen held the phone, Marcus's heart clenched at Andrea's worried voice on the speaker. Marcus? What's wrong? Andrea, honey. I'm being taken to the police station. There's been a misunderstanding. He struggled to keep his voice composed, conscious of the officer's scrutiny. Brian's inhaler prescription is ready at Mitchell's pharmacy. Could you? Taken to the station? Marcus, what are they saying? This is ridiculous, you haven't. It's okay, he interrupted, seeing Morrison's patience wearing thin. Just take care of Brian first. Then call Richard Solomon's office. The mention of his lawyer's name drew a slight reaction from Morrison, a tightening around the eyes, a subtle shift in stance. "Time's up," Morrison announced, moving forward with handcuffs ready. "Marcus Thompson, you're under arrest for armed robbery. You have the right to remain silent." As Morrison recited the Miranda rights, his practiced words echoing in the stunned silence of the reception area, he noticed something odd. Thompson wasn't acting like most guilty suspects. No protestations of innocence, no anger, no attempt to flee. Just a dignified resignation that seemed at odds with Morrison's profile of him. Lisa Martinez had pulled out her phone and was furiously typing, her face set in determination. "I'm documenting everything," she declared. "And I'm calling the center's board of directors. They'll confirm Marcus's whereabouts during every single one of those robberies." Morrison felt a flicker of unease but pushed it aside. He'd learned long ago not to let potential alibis shake his confidence. Evidence could be manufactured, witnesses could be coordinated. He'd seen it all before. As they led Thompson out through the community center's main doors, they passed a wall of photos. Morrison's eye caught on one in particular, a group shot of smiling students surrounding Thompson at what appeared to be a graduation ceremony. The date stamp in the corner was from the week of one of the robberies. But more disturbing was the familiar face Morrison spotted in the background of the photo, partially obscured but unmistakable. A face he saw every morning in the picture frame on his desk. His son, Michael. Morrison's step faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered, tightening his grip on Thompson's arm as they approached the patrol car. He'd deal with that detail later. Right now, he had a suspect to process and a case to close. Behind them, Lisa Martinez's voice carried across the parking lot as she spoke rapidly into her phone. "Michael, thank God you picked up. You're not going to believe what's happening to Marcus." Michael Morrison burst through the precinct doors like a thunderstorm, his dress shirt wrinkled from the hasty drive across town, his father's features hardened on a younger face. The desk sergeant looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes. Everyone in the department knew the sergeant's son, even if they hadn't seen him since he'd left for his nonprofit work 3 years ago. "Where is he?" Michael demanded, his voice carrying through the bullpen. "Where's my father?" Officer Chen, who had been updating the booking report, stood up from her desk. "Michael? What are you?" "The man you arrested today, Marcus Thompson. He's my boss. My mentor." Michael's words cut through the sudden silence. "And I can prove he's innocent." In the interrogation room, Morrison sat across from Marcus, a recording device between them capturing the heavy silence. He'd been studying the suspect for 10 minutes, employing the waiting technique that usually made people nervous enough to talk. But Thompson just sat there, calm and composed, as if he were still in his classroom. The door opened abruptly. "Sergeant," Officer Rodriguez stepped in, his face tense. "You're needed outside. It's urgent." Morrison's irritation at the interruption vanished when he stepped into the hallway and saw his son standing there, familiar righteous anger blazing in his eyes. The same look he'd worn during their last argument, the night Michael had announced he was leaving his law school track to work in community development. "What are you doing here?" Morrison managed, his authority wavering in the face of his son's presence. "Really, Dad? That's your first question?" Michael held up his phone, showing a calendar app. "I'm here because you just arrested an innocent man. A man who's spent the last 3 years transforming lives while you've been building a case based on nothing but prejudice and profiling." "Watch yourself," Morrison warned, glancing around at the other officers pretending not to listen. "This is an ongoing investigation." "An investigation?" Michael laughed bitterly. "I've been working with Marcus at the center for 2 years. I've seen him mentor kids others gave up on, help seniors navigate technology, run food drives during COVID. But you didn't bother to do even basic background checking, did you? Because you saw what you wanted to see." Morrison felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "Son, you don't understand how these cases work. Sometimes people hide their true." "No, you don't understand." Michael's voice cracked with emotion. Remember when you missed my college graduation because of a case? It was Marcus who came. When I was struggling with the decision to leave law school, it was Marcus who helped me see that I could make a difference in other ways. He's been more of a father figure to me these past 2 years than. He stopped, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Morrison stood frozen, memories washing over him, all the missed dinners, the growing silence between them, the distance he'd told himself was just part of his son growing up. But it hadn't been growth, it had been withdrawal. Here, Michael thrust his phone forward, showing a series of photos and videos. Security footage from our cameras. Time-stamped documentation of every program Marcus has run. Witness statements from dozens of community members. Everything you would have found if you'd looked for evidence of innocence as hard as you looked for evidence of guilt. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Morrison felt the familiar certainty that had guided his career crumbling, replaced by a sickening realization. He had been so sure, so convinced by his instincts, that he'd ignored clear signs pointing to Thompson's innocence. Worse, he'd been ready to destroy an innocent man's life, a man who, by some cosmic irony, had been there for his son when he hadn't been. From the interrogation room window, Marcus watched the confrontation between father and son unfold. He couldn't hear their words, but he recognized the pain and recognition dawning on Morrison's face, the same expression he'd seen in the mirror years ago, when he'd finally understood that his own father's rigid beliefs had cost him relationships he could never fully repair. Officer Chen approached Morrison, holding a file. "Sergeant? We just got confirmation of another robbery. Same MO, same description, while Mr. Thompson was in custody." The last piece of Morrison's certainty shattered. He looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time in years, and saw not just the anger but the disappointment beneath it. The weight of his badge, worn for so long with pride, suddenly felt like lead on his chest. "Dad," Michael said quietly, his anger giving way to something more complex, "what are you going to do now?" Morrison stood in front of the interrogation room door, his hand hovering over the handle. Behind him, Michael waited with barely contained impatience. The squad room had grown unusually quiet, other officers finding sudden interest in their paperwork while stealing glances at the unfolding drama. 23 years of certainty were crumbling around him. Every combination on his office wall, every conviction he'd secured, every instinct he'd trusted, all of it now cast in a different light. How many other times had he seen what he expected to see, rather than what was actually there? He pushed open the door. Marcus Thompson looked up, his expression unchanged from earlier, though his eyes flickered briefly to Michael's figure in the doorway. "Mr. Thompson," Morrison began, then stopped. The formal title felt wrong, an insufficient acknowledgement of his error. "Marcus." There's been a development." "Another robbery," Marcus said quietly. "It wasn't a question. While I've been here." Morrison sank into the chair across from him, the weight of his mistake pressing down on his shoulders. "Yes. And my son, he's provided extensive documentation of your whereabouts during the other incidents." He forced himself to meet Marcus's gaze. "I was wrong. And I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, barely scratching the surface of the damage he'd nearly caused. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then glanced at Michael, who had moved to stand protectively near his mentor. "You know what the hardest part was?" Marcus finally spoke, his voice controlled but carrying years of accumulated pain. "Not the handcuffs, or the stares from my neighbors as you walked me out. It was knowing that my son might have seen it. That he might grow up thinking this is normal, that being treated as guilty until proven innocent is just part of being who we are." Morrison flinched. He thought of his own son, standing there witnessing his father's prejudice laid bare. "Your son, Brian, right? The inhaler." "Andrea would have picked it up by now," Marcus said. "She's had practice handling crises while I'm unavailable." The subtle emphasis on the last word cut through Morrison like a blade. Michael stepped forward. "Dad, Marcus needs to be released. Now. And there needs to be a formal acknowledgement of wrongful arrest." "Of course," Morrison nodded, reaching for his keys. But as he moved to unlock the handcuffs, his hands were shaking slightly, a first in his career. As the cuffs came off, he noticed the slight redness on Marcus's wrists, another physical reminder of his rush to judgment. "I'll start the paperwork immediately," he continued, the familiar bureaucratic phrases feeling hollow. "We'll need your signature on some forms, but you're free to go. Your personal effects are—" "Actually," Marcus interrupted, rubbing his wrists, "before I leave, I'd like to show you something." He reached for the phone Michael was holding out to him and pulled up a photo. "This is from last month's graduation ceremony. Your son gave the keynote speech." Morrison leaned forward to look. The photo showed Michael addressing a crowd, his face animated with passion. In the audience, Marcus sat with an older white man who was beaming with pride. "That's David Kennedy," Marcus explained. "Former police officer, now one of our most dedicated volunteers. He teaches a course on community relations, helping bridge the gap between law enforcement and our neighborhood. He's shown me that not all officers let their preconceptions define their actions." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We have an open invitation for other officers to attend, to see the community as people rather than statistics or profiles." The implication was clear, an opportunity for redemption, not just through words but through actions. Morrison felt something shift inside him, a crack in the fortress of certainty he'd built over his career. From the doorway, Officer Chen cleared her throat softly. "Sergeant? The release forms are ready. And Captain Rivera would like to see you in his office once you're done." Morrison nodded, knowing his actions would have consequences beyond this room. His career, his reputation, the very foundation of how he'd conducted himself as an officer, everything would need to be reevaluated. But as he watched Marcus stand, straightening his clothes with quiet dignity, he realized something else had been irreparably changed, his understanding of what it meant to protect and serve. The true measure of justice wasn't in the arrests made or cases closed, but in the lives impacted, for better or worse, by the choices he made while wearing his badge. The evening air felt different as Morrison left the precinct 3 hours later. His meeting with Captain Rivera had been exactly what he'd expected, a mixture of disappointment, anger, and bureaucratic consequences. 2 weeks suspension without pay, mandatory sensitivity training, and a formal review of his recent cases. The captain's words still echoed in his head, "You're lucky Thompson isn't pressing charges. This could have ended your career." But it wasn't the professional consequences weighing heaviest on his mind. It was the image of Marcus Thompson's reunion with his family in the precinct lobby, his wife Andrea's fierce embrace, their son Brian's confused questions about why Daddy had been gone so long. Morrison had watched from a distance as Marcus knelt down to his son's level, speaking softly, somehow finding the strength to turn this trauma into a teaching moment. Now, standing in the parking lot, Morrison found himself facing another difficult conversation. Michael hadn't left yet, leaning against his car, waiting. "I thought you'd be gone by now," Morrison said, approaching cautiously. "Don't you have classes to teach tomorrow?" "They can wait." Michael straightened up. "We need to talk, Dad. Really talk, not just throw accusations and walk away like last time." Morrison nodded, feeling the weight of years of unspoken words between them. "There's a diner around the corner. Still open late." The walk was silent, both men lost in their thoughts. The diner was nearly empty, just a few night shift workers nursing cups of coffee. They slid into a booth far from the other customers, the vinyl seats squeaking beneath them. "You know what scared me most today?" Michael finally spoke after they'd ordered coffee. "How unsurprised I was. When Lisa called, part of me thought, of course Dad would do this. What does that say about how I see you?" Morrison wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, seeking warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "It says I've given you every reason to think the worst of me. And not just today. Marcus asked about you, you know. Over the years. He could tell from things I said that we were distant. He actually encouraged me to reach out more. The man I wrongly arrested was trying to help repair my relationship with my son." Morrison laughed bitterly. There's some cosmic irony there. He's like that, Michael said softly. Always seeing the best in people, even when they don't deserve it. Even after everything he's been through, he still believes people can change. A waitress refilled their cups, the coffee pot trembling slightly in her aged hands. Morrison watched the ripples in his cup, thinking of how easily certainty could be disturbed. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted. Any of it. The department, my record, what I did to Thompson's family. You. Maybe that's the problem, Michael replied. You're still thinking like a cop, looking for a solution, a way to close the case. Some things can't be fixed, Dad. They can only be learned from. Morrison looked up at his son, really looked at him. Gone was the angry young man who'd stormed out 3 years ago. In his place sat someone who'd found his purpose, his strength. Someone who'd found these things not through his father's guidance, but despite his father's expectations. Tell me about your work, Morrison said suddenly. At the center. All this time, I've never really asked. Michael's surprise was visible, but he began to speak, hesitantly at first, then with growing animation. He told his father about the literacy programs, the job training initiatives, the lives changed one small victory at a time. As he spoke, Morrison saw his son's world expanding before him, a world where success wasn't measured in arrests and convictions, but in moments of human connection and growth. You know, Michael said, pausing in his description of a recent graduation ceremony, Marcus is starting a new program next month. Bringing in law enforcement officers to meet with community members, not as authorities or adversaries, but as people. Breaking down barriers on both sides. The invitation in his words was clear. Morrison thought of Thompson's earlier mention of Officer Kennedy, of bridges that could be built. Would they? Morrison cleared his throat. Would they accept someone like me? After what I did? That's the whole point, Dad. Michael reached across the table, not quite touching his father's hand, but closing the distance. It's about who you choose to become, not who you've been. Outside the diner's windows, the city's night shift continued, patrol cars rolling past, ambulances in the distance, the steady pulse of urban life. But inside, in the quiet of their booth, father and son began the slow work of building something new from the ruins of old certainties. A week into his suspension, Morrison found himself standing outside the Riverside Community Center, his civilian clothes feeling strange after years of wearing the uniform. The building looked different in the morning light, less institutional, more welcoming. Through the windows, he could see people coming and going, carrying books, laptops, and hope. He checked his watch, 9:45 a.m. Michael had suggested he come early to observe Marcus's morning computer class. Just watch, his son had said. See what you missed while you were building your case. As Morrison reached for the door, it opened from inside. Lisa Martinez stood there, her expression guarded but not hostile. Sergeant Morrison. Michael said you might come. Just Morrison is fine, he replied quietly. I'm not here officially. She nodded, leading him through the lobby. The walls he'd barely noticed during the arrest were covered with success stories, GED certificates, college acceptance letters, citizenship papers. Lives transformed, one achievement at a time. Our regulars know you're coming, Lisa said as they walked. Marcus insisted on transparency. He told them this is what our center stands for: second chances, growth, understanding. Not everyone agreed with him. Morrison absorbed this, feeling the weight of Thompson's grace. I wouldn't have agreed to let me in either. No, you wouldn't have, Lisa stopped, turning to face him. A week ago. But that's the point, isn't it? They reached classroom 3, where Marcus was already teaching. Morrison hung back in the doorway, watching. The scene was nothing like he'd imagined during his investigation. Thompson moved among his students, elderly residents learning email, middle-aged workers updating their tech skills, teenagers coding websites. He showed infinite patience, switching between Spanish and English, adapting his teaching style to each learner's needs. That's Mrs. Rodriguez, Lisa whispered, pointing to an elderly woman Marcus was helping. She's learning computer skills so she can apply for benefits online. 3 months ago, she was getting scammed trying to do it through a private service. Morrison watched as Marcus guided Mrs. Rodriguez through a complex form, his manner gentle but empowering. "You've got this, Senora," he encouraged. "Just like we practiced." The door opened behind them, and Officer Chen walked in, also in civilian clothes. She froze momentarily upon seeing Morrison. "Officer Chen," he asked, surprised. "Sarah," she corrected. I signed up for the community outreach program. After everything that happened, I wanted to understand better." She hesitated. "I should have spoken up more strongly that day, about the evidence." "No," Morrison shook his head. "I wouldn't have listened. But we're both here now." The class continued, and Morrison observed a side of his precinct's jurisdiction he'd never really seen before. He recognized faces, people he'd previously noted only as potential suspects or witnesses, now revealed as complex individuals with dreams, struggles, and determination. During a break, Marcus approached them. The moment could have been awkward, even hostile, but Thompson's demeanor remained as composed as it had been in the interrogation room. "I'm glad you came," he said simply. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." He gestured to a teenage boy setting up laptops in the back. "That's Deshaun. 3 years ago, he was caught shoplifting. The responding officer could have arrested him, ruined his chances. Instead, she brought him here." Morrison watched as Deshaun confidently helped an older student troubleshoot a technical issue. "What happened to the officer?" "She's Detective Williams now," Marcus smiled. "She still mentors Deshaun. Comes to all his robotics competitions." He paused, letting that sink in. "There's always another way, Morrison. Always a chance to write a different ending to the story." The words struck Morrison deeply. He thought of all the arrests he'd made, the lives he'd impacted, the stories he'd thought he'd understood completely. How many Deshaun's had he encountered without seeing their potential? "Your next class," Morrison said hesitantly. Would it be appropriate if I stayed?" Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It's a digital literacy workshop for seniors. Many of them have had negative experiences with authority figures. Seeing you here, learning alongside them, it might change some perspectives. On both sides." As new students began filtering in, Morrison found himself being guided to a computer station. The screen displayed a basic email tutorial, but he knew he'd be learning far more than computer skills today. "Morrison," Marcus called softly from the front of the room. "One more thing. Brian asked about you at dinner last night. He wanted to know if you were a bad person." He held Morrison's gaze. "I told him no. I told him you were someone learning to see with new eyes. Don't prove me wrong." 2 weeks had passed, and Morrison found himself spending more time at the community center than at home. His suspension was ending tomorrow, but the lessons he'd learned in this building had reshaped his understanding of police work more profoundly than any department training ever had. Today was different, though. Today, Marcus had invited both Morrison and Michael to his home for Sunday dinner, a tradition in the Thompson household that Morrison remembered having with his own family, before badges and cases had taken precedence over everything else. Standing on the Thompsons' front porch, Morrison straightened his collar for the 3rd time. Michael, beside him, noticed his father's nervousness. "You've faced armed suspects with less anxiety," Michael observed, ringing the doorbell. "Armed suspects are simpler," Morrison replied. "You know where you stand." The door opened to reveal Brian, Marcus's son, who looked up at them with curious eyes. "You're Michael's dad," he said to Morrison. "The police officer who made a mistake." Morrison felt the simple truth of those words hit harder than any adult's accusation. "Yes, I am. Dad says everyone makes mistakes," Brian continued. "He says what matters is what you do after." The boy's asthma inhaler hung from a lanyard around his neck, a constant reminder of the night Morrison's actions had nearly prevented Brian from getting his medication. Andrea appeared behind her son, her expression complex but not unwelcoming. "Please, come in. Marcus is finishing up in the kitchen." The Thompson home told its own story, walls lined with books and family photos, Brian's artwork proudly displayed, certificates of achievement from the community center mounted alongside family vacation snapshots. It was a home built on love, learning, and resilience. In the kitchen, Marcus was teaching Brian how to make cornbread using his grandmother's recipe. The domestic scene was so far removed from the interrogation room that Morrison felt a fresh wave of shame at how he'd prejudged this man's life. Brian raised his hand next, his inhaler catching the fluorescent light. "Can you tell them about Deshaun? About how he's teaching me robotics now?" As Morrison shared Deshaun's story, he watched understanding dawn on young faces. These children, still untouched by many of society's prejudices, grasped something that had taken him decades to learn, that every person's story was complex, worthy of attention and understanding. After the presentation, as the children filed out for recess, Marcus approached him. "That wasn't easy," he said quietly. "Admitting your mistakes in front of your own son is one thing. Doing it in front of a room full of children. They deserve the truth," Morrison replied. "They deserve to see that the people meant to protect them can acknowledge their failures and work to do better." He paused, watching Brian playing with his classmates through the classroom window. "Besides, they're the future of this community. The changes we're trying to make, they're the ones who'll carry them forward." Marcus nodded, then checked his watch. "Speaking of changes, the center's board meeting is in an hour. They're reviewing our proposal for the Police Community Partnership Program." "Our proposal," Morrison corrected, still amazed at how life had brought him to this point. "Think they'll approve it?" "They will," Marcus said with quiet confidence. "Because this time, we're not just talking about building bridges. We're showing them it's already happening." 6 months later, the Riverside Community Center buzzed with anticipation. The newly renovated multi-purpose room was filled to capacity for the graduation ceremony of the first Police Community Partnership Program. Photos of the graduating class lined the walls, officers and community members who had spent the past months learning from each other, breaking down barriers, and building understanding. Morrison stood at the podium, his uniform crisp but somehow sitting differently on his shoulders now. In the audience, familiar faces looked back at him, Marcus and Andrea Thompson with Brian, who proudly wore his new robotics competition medal, Michael, sitting beside Sarah Chen, their hands discreetly linked, Lisa Martinez with the center's board members, and Deshaun, now a peer mentor in the youth program. 6 months ago, Morrison began, his voice carrying across the hushed room, "I stood in this building as a man who thought he knew everything about protecting and serving. I was wrong. What I knew was how to enforce. What I needed to learn was how to connect." He gestured to the graduating class. "Look around this room. Every person here has a story about the divide between law enforcement and the community. Some wore badges and thought that gave them all the answers. Some faced prejudice and thought that defined their relationship with authority. But we all had something in common, we were willing to learn a different way." In the front row, Captain Rivera nodded approvingly. The program's success had exceeded everyone's expectations, with measurable decreases in both crime rates and civilian complaints. But the statistics didn't tell the whole story. "My own journey began with a mistake," Morrison continued. "A terrible mistake that could have destroyed an innocent man's life. But through the grace of that man, he met Marcus's eyes, and the wisdom of my son, that mistake became a catalyst for change." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "There's a quote that's become something of a motto for our program: the truth is bulletproof. Marcus Thompson's father taught him that, and Marcus taught it to me. But I've learned that truth isn't just about facts and evidence. It's about acknowledging our biases, confronting our prejudices, and being honest about our capacity for both error and growth." Brian whispered something to his father, who smiled and nodded. Morrison watched their interaction, remembering how close he'd come to tearing that relationship apart. Today, we're graduating 40 officers and 40 community members who've committed to being bridges rather than barriers. But this is just the beginning. Next month, we're expanding the program to 3 more precincts. The Youth Mentorship Initiative, led by Deshawn and Officer Chen, has a waiting list. And our Community Advisory Board, co-chaired by Marcus Thompson, is reshaping department policies on everything from officer training to community engagement. Morrison turned to the graduates. You'll leave here today with certificates, but your real achievement isn't on paper. It's in the relationships you've built, the perspectives you've gained, and the changes you'll create in your communities. Because that's what true justice looks like, not us versus them, but all of us together, acknowledging our shared humanity and working toward a better future. After the ceremony, as families mingled and celebrated, Morrison found himself in a quiet corner with Marcus and Michael. Brian had dragged Sarah off to show her his latest robotics project, his voice animated with excitement. "Did you ever imagine this?" Michael asked, watching the diverse crowd interact with natural ease. "6 months ago, when you were building that case against Marcus?" Morrison shook his head. "I was so certain back then. Certain about everything except what really mattered." He turned to Marcus. "Your father's saying about truth being bulletproof, I understand it differently now. Truth isn't just what we think we know. It's what we're willing to learn." Speaking of learning, Marcus smiled. "Brian has an announcement he wants to make at dinner tonight. Something about wanting to become a police officer and a robotics teacher. Says he wants to be like both his dads." Morrison felt his throat tighten. "Both his?" "You've been at our Sunday dinners every week for 6 months, Marcus said quietly. You've helped him with homework, cheered at his robotics competitions, talked him through his fears about using his inhaler at school. As far as he's concerned, he's got 2 fathers looking out for him now. If you're okay with that." Morrison looked around the room, at the officers chatting easily with community members, at Sarah showing Deshawn a new computer program, at Michael laughing with Andrea about something. All of these connections, these bridges, born from what could have been a tragedy. "You know what the real miracle is," he said finally. "Not that you forgave me, but that you showed me how to forgive myself. How to take an ugly truth about who I was and transform it into a beautiful truth about who I could become." Marcus squeezed his shoulder. "That's the thing about truth, James. When we're brave enough to face it, it doesn't just set us free, it shows us who we really are and who we can be. All we have to do is open our eyes and our hearts wide enough to see it." As they headed out to the parking lot, the setting sun painted the community center in warm hues. The building's sign had recently been updated to include a new tagline, "Building bridges, changing lives, one truth at a time." Morrison paused to look at it, remembering the man he'd been 6 months ago, grateful for the man he was becoming. In the distance, Brian's voice called out, "Hurry up, Dad. Both of you. Mom says the cornbread won't wait forever." And in that moment, surrounded by the family he'd found through facing his own truth, Morrison understood the deepest moral of his journey, that justice without compassion is merely power, but justice with understanding can transform not just laws and actions, but hearts and lives. The truth, indeed, was bulletproof, and so was the human capacity for change, if only we're brave enough to embrace it.